All right, so we have Chazan Krausman, we have Rabbi Appel. We're continuing what we weren't even able to get started yet, which is our life cycle events in the ongoing topics. But we are not going to be derailed, and we're going to continue with Chazan and with Rabbi in terms of the mourning process. And so we're just going to turn it right over to you. We've got lots, we've got a stack of them.
Fantastic. Well, it's nice to see a few people's faces and everybody else's black box with their name in it. So I'd encourage you, once again, if you like to show your lovely face to us, we'd really appreciate it. It makes it so much easier to teach when you can see who you're speaking. So I guess since I'm talking already, should I keep on talking? All right. So this is a topic that all of us at some point or another will end up dealing with. And so it is, certainly of interest to everyone. So our plan is kind of to go through the process of Jewish mourning, and to talk about some of the issues involved with it, and also to look at some traditional sources to see what our rabbis have to say on the matter. So I think what we're going to do, Rabbi Appel, do you want to say something, or should we go?
Yeah, I want to say that because we're speaking about Jewish mourning customs and practices, it might cause memories of times when you were mourning somebody. So just understand that, this could be a heavy subject. This could be a subject of interest. You could have questions that you are, dying to ask us, no pun intended.
I like
But we understand that it's a complicated topic. So we're glad that you're here tonight. Should I start with our video?
Yes. Why don't we start? We have a video to share that kind of is an excellent overview. So you're gonna have to, you're sharing your screen.
But I'm remembering to share the sound.
Yeah,
which is
I've done that.
vital.
Audio class with no sounds.
Oh, I've done that too.
The death of a loved one is a very disorienting time and isn't something many people think about.
So, but if I turn off the speaker on my computer, will the sound still
Come
happen?
over this Zoom.
Okay, let's find out.
It was
Until
sounding
it's
all right.
actually happening to them. Judaism offers structured periods of mourning that help provide some support in the grieving process. Jewish tradition is to bury the dead as soon as possible. The period from the time of death until the funeral is called aninut. After hearing about a death, immediate family members may tear a piece of their clothing. This ripping is called kriya. You're tearing a hole in the fabric of your normal life. Many do kriya at the funeral. During aninut, many people don't know what to say or do. Sometimes they ask mourners, "Is there anything I can do?" They get the automatic response, "No, I've got it under control." If you're a mourner, accept help. It's okay. You have a lot to plan, a lot on your mind. If you're a friend, offer to take care of errands, grocery store runs, walking the dog. It gives you a way to connect with the mourners and help in their grieving process. Meanwhile, traditionally, a chevra kadisha, or burial society, takes care of the body. You can find one through a funeral home or synagogue. As swiftly as possible, the funeral happens, sometimes the next day. Afterwards, friends and relatives bring a meal of consolation to the mourners. Unlike normal meals, where you are a gracious host, at this meal, the community takes care of you. Then Shiva begins. Traditionally, it lasts for 7 days after the burial and is an intense mourning period spent at home by the immediate family. The first 30 days after the burial comprise another period called Shloshim, when the family can go outside the house. During the Shloshim, some people won't go to concerts or parties, wear new clothes or shave. And for the children of the deceased, The entire mourning period,
My apologies.
called Avelut, lasts for nearly a year, during which mourners recite a prayer called the Mourner's Kaddish daily. At the end of Avelut, there's an unveiling service to place the tombstone at the grave. It's a time to remember again, to close this intense part of the cycle of mourning. But we never forget our loved ones. 4 times a year, there is a special Yizkor service in synagogues to remember all those we've lost. And each year, on the anniversary of their passing, we say Kaddish again and light a Yortzeit candle in their memory. To learn more, there are 4 more videos in this series. They discuss caring for the body, the funeral, Shiva, and how to say the mourner's Kaddish.
Okay, so the video that we saw gives a very good overview to the topic. And it is meant to kind of reflect the most standard practices of Jewish mourning. So some communities, some practices may differ slightly. Somebody had a question about the style of the caskets that were offered. I think that was really a graphics thing more than a suggestion. So I think we might take a moment and kind of delve more into the different steps of the process of mourning, if that's okay with you. Should we? Okay. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen now.
Okay.
There we go. Okay, well, let's scroll. It sort of does. Okay, so this is from a wonderful website called myjewishlearning.com. By the way, if you're looking for a good source of learning on a variety of Jewish topics, this is a fantastic site. So we'll very quickly go through some of these stages, and I think it's fair to say that if anyone has a question at any time, we'll take their questions. Yes, so if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat, or if you're live and in color, you can just scream it out. So the first stage of mourning, by the way, I should say that although I'm not a psychologist, I think that if you look at this process, you would see that there's many things that Judaism does right. Some things you may say we don't get right, but I think in terms of the process of grieving and mourning, I think our rabbis really nailed this. And this is from many centuries ago. But if this process really is beneficial to the family of the deceased, and it really is important. Also, it's important to know that there's a point at which, at the beginning of the process, our focus is on the deceased, but very quickly the focus of the process turns to the mourner. And that should be something that we all have in mind. Hopefully, we shouldn't be involved with that process, but if we have a friend or a loved one, we should be mindful of that as well. So Aniyinut is the first step, and that takes place from the moment of death until the burial. And that period of time, individuals are exempt from, and probably aren't expected to, any kind of practical mitzvot, any obligations. And so we don't expect them to come to the synagogue. We don't ask them to observe any of the time-bound Jewish laws. And we let them kind of just try to be themselves and don't expect anything from them. The next step is the funeral. And as the website correctly points out, it's very important that the funeral take place as quickly as possible. In some communities, it can even take place the same day. But in most communities, we try to do that as quickly as possible. And that is something that's very important in terms of respect for the dead person, kavod hamet. It's very important mitzvah. And the liturgy of the funeral we can kind of talk about, but it does, the website does mention the El Malei Rachamim, which is a prayer mourning that we say at every funeral, and we'll also repeat that during the Yisker service as well. So it's a prayer that is really associated with mourning and talks about God as a source of mercy and compassion. Once we return from the cemetery, it is customary for the family to return to their house and to have a meal of consolation prepared for them. It is some places that turns into a big celebration that takes place at a synagogue, but traditionally the family goes back to their home only with their close friends and relatives. It's not an occasion to celebrate by any means, but it's an occasion to deal with the family and to make sure that they eat and that they're able to begin their process of Shiva. Am I doing okay? Okay, good. Okay, so the next part, Shiva, is a traditional period of 7 days during which the family kind of retreats from society and focuses on getting themselves to a point where they're ready to face society once again. But Jewish mourning, and people who are mourning are never left alone. When you lose someone, it's a loss for the entire community. So it's traditional for the community to come to the house of Shiva to make sure that they can say Kaddish, the memorial prayer, and also to make sure that they're taken care of. And we'll talk a bunch about Shiva as we go along. The next step is Shloshim, which literally means 30. And this is a 30-day period that begins from the day of the funeral. Following Shiva, the mourner can return to work, but during Shloshim, it's traditional for mourners to avoid parties, concerts, live music, any kind of public celebration or entertainment. And then at the end of Shloshim, the formal mourning period ends. But for those who are mourning a direct relative, so a sibling or a spouse, a sibling or a parent, then the period takes place over a year. And so traditionally mourners will say Kaddish for 11 months, and there are different reasons why the number 11 is used. We can get into that. And then traditionally after that, we have an unveiling in cemeteries that use many of our cemeteries don't have a large headstone. We only have a footstone. But some kind of monument dedication ceremony is involved. That doesn't necessarily have to be a year later. It could be as soon as a month later, but that is kind of part of the process as well. And then, of course, every year on the anniversary of passing, we have Yortzeit, which is an occasion to observe the anniversary of loved ones passing. And of course, during the year, as the video mentioned, we also have Yisker 4 times during the year. Thank you. So that is, in a very quick outline, the steps of Jewish mourning. But those steps, if followed, will really be a benefit to people who try to go through the process of grieving and find their way back into society.
Mm-hmm. What's wonderful about it is that it's phased with acknowledgement to the intensity of feelings in each of the phases. So I agree with the Chazan that it is really skillfully crafted, and there aren't, the number of people who would go through all of the steps in our modern age are it's not necessarily what everybody does. We can start with the prolonging of the period of aninut, the period between the death and the burial, where I've tried to speak with families and explain to them that they would be better off if the funeral would be sooner. But for a variety of reasons, they want to delay. Or we could talk about Shiva, that period of 7 days when the family is at home. And, you know, I don't know the last time that we had somebody at Temple Israel who did all 7 days of Shiva. At Bethel, what's typical for you?
I also don't recall that happening outside of myself. I don't know if anyone else in our community has done that. Some people observe a few days or 1 day. For some people that they don't observe Shiva at all. They have some kind of meal a meal constellation after the funeral, and then just come to minyan in the synagogue. So it is important to come to say Kaddish, but the idea of withdrawing from the community for that period of time is extremely important and very, very helpful. And it would, if there is one practice that I would encourage of things that we seem to have kind of lost in our, at least in our liberal communities, it would be to return to that particular practice. Even if you can't have services in your house every day, to at least take that 7-day period and have friends and dear ones come over. And even if you go to shul, if you don't want to have services in your home, even if you just take that time to separate yourself from the community, is extremely beneficial.
Because I think it acknowledges your vulnerability in that moment. And the intense nature of the emotions that can be happening. Before we move to the next thing, does anybody have any questions either online or in person that you've been wanting to ask? Sherry, my response to why were there fancy coffins is that not all funeral homes only serve Jewish customers. And not all people who are Jews are interested in the typical plain pine box. Some people do want a fancier casket, even though that's not typical. And there's actually a text that we brought about fancy caskets, because believe it or not, that was a problem back in the day, like millennia ago. So, but if anybody has any questions before we go to the next thing. Okay. Why don't I've got this as a PDF that I can share on screen if that's okay.
Sure, that sounds great.
Okay.
All right, so I think what we'll do is we're going to look at some sources. Those of us who are in the room have a copy of this, and luckily Rabbi Appel is infinitely more organized than I am, and so she has everything all ready so we can look at it together. And so we'll look at some of these sources, and hopefully they will also lead us to talking about some of the issues that kind of surround the whole notion of comforting the mourner and mourning as well.
So it was interesting because what happened was that each of us put together a source sheet, and I went through and kept almost all the things that we both did, and then added some of yours and took out some of mine.
Oh, okay.
So,
There we go. So it's a question of who got better results when they searched Safaria for sources.
oh, I don't know about that.
Okay.
So for those of you who are referring to Safaria, Safaria.org is an amazing resource for Jewish texts in English and in German and in Aramaic and in Hebrew. And pretty much any text that you could imagine is contained therein, and you can find things based on themes. So we've got a question.
Oh no, Karen has got the website
Yes,
up already. She
Yes,
is
that's
correct
not
with
an
that.
oh no, she's definitely.
Rabbi,
Yes,
stop the share and go back and choose the PDF to share instead of your desktop, because we're seeing the
I thought I
shadow
was
of.
sharing from the PDF. This is,
No, you grabbed the desktop, so
Did
you're
I
seeing
really? I
the
hate doing
shadow
that.
of the Zoom stuff. The PDF may be after the first option. Because we're still
okay,
seeing
so
the
let me do
Zoom.
this.
Yeah, because we're seeing Zoom artifacts.
Yeah, I hate when that happens.
Mhm.
Hang on. There we go. Come on. How's that?
All right.
That works.
Yay.
Perfect.
Okay, so this is about consoling the mourner. One should follow the attributes of the Holy One, blessed be God, just as the Holy One, blessed be God, consoles mourners, as it is written, and it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed Isaac his son. So too should you console mourners, just as the Holy One, blessed be God, buried the dead, as it is written, and he was buried in the land, in the valley in the land of Moab. So too should you bury the dead. Rabbi Simlai expounded, the Torah begins with loving kindness and ends with loving kindness. It begins with loving kindness, as it is written, and God made for Adam and his wife coats of skin, and God dressed them. It ends with loving kindness, as it is written, and God buried him in a valley. This text is really pretty amazing because it talks about the loving kindness that comes both from consoling the mourners and from burying the dead. That both, each of those is considered a mitzvah in its own right. And that each of those is something that we should, just as God did it, it's something that we should emulate. And that both of them are incredibly, incredibly important.
But perhaps the greatest thing that we can do as Jewish people is to try to get as close as we can to God. And the pathway to doing that is by emulating God's attributes. Just like when we have kids, our kids, if they emulate our attributes, we feel as though they're showing us respect and love, and we feel closer to them. So too, if you imagine God as a parent in that kind of image, the closer we are to emulating God's attributes, the closer we feel to God.
Okay, and the other way of thinking about this is that it is a gift that we give to those who are deceased, that we know they will never reciprocate. Okay, it is something that we are giving to them without any expectation of reciprocation. So another way of thinking of this. This next text is about the period of aninut, that period after the death and before the burial, which I still remember learning from my teachers in seminary. Rabbi Shimon, the son of Elazar, says, do not comfort them when their dead lie before them. Until it speaks of that moment, until the burial is over, there's no way that you're going to be able to comfort somebody. There's no way, there's just too much going on. There's too much, the grief is too intense, and there's just no way that you would be able to comfort them.
And I think what you're going to see a theme here is that sometimes the best thing to say to somebody when a dear one has passed away is just to stand beside them. Sometimes the less you say, the more helpful you are. I've seen people be less helpful by saying more than vice versa.
Okay, so why don't you dig into this one?
Okay, so in this Gemara, they're talking about what you do at a Shiva house, and also more importantly, the whole concept of that everyone is the same. Right? When we mentioned, well, we'll read this and then we'll talk about that. But the sages taught the following baraita. At first, the meal after burial would be brought into the house of mourner in various ways. The wealthy would bring the meal in baskets of silver and gold, and the poor would bring it in baskets of peeled willow branches. And the poor were embarrassed, as everyone would see that they were poor. The sages instituted that everyone should bring the meal in baskets of peeled willow branches due to the honor of the poor. Right, so this kind of goes back again to Sherry's question as well about the plain pine box, that everyone is the same in death and we're all born and we all end up the same. And so no one is better or worse, and so everyone should be treated equally. And so we always do the most simple thing so that everyone is equal. The sages all taught in a similar baraita. At first, they would serve wine in the house of mourner during the first meal after the burial. The wealthy would do so in cups made of white glass, and the poor would serve this wine in cups of colored glass, and the poor were embarrassed, as everyone would see that they were poor. The sages instructed that all should serve drinks in the house of the mourner in colored cups. So again, the same thing. We don't embarrass the poor, but most importantly, that everyone should be treated equally. Furthermore, at first they would uncover the faces of the wealthy who passed away and cover the faces of the poor, because their faces were blackened by famine and the poor were embarrassed because they were buried in a different manner. The sages instituted that everyone's face should be covered due to the honor of the poor. Okay, so it is now the Jewish custom that we never, once someone passes away, they are prepared and they are put in a shroud and they were placed in a casket, and we don't do any kind of public viewing. And this is one of the reasons for that, is that we don't want to differentiate between the wealthy and the poor, that we're all the same at that point. Okay. Additionally, at first the wealthy would take the deceased out for burial on a gargash, which is a fancy platform, like a bier, I guess. And the poor would take the deceased out on a plain bier made from poles that were strapped together, and the poor were embarrassed. The sages instituted that everyone should be taken out for burial on a plain bier due to the honor of the poor. Okay, it's not a custom that we have anymore. We don't physically carry people to their funeral. These things are all done by professionals nowadays. But still, the idea is that we treat everyone equally in death, and that we don't take any opportunity to embarrass anyone. We make sure that everyone is equal. Okay. Problem to the point that the relatives sometimes abandon the corpse and run away. So again, this lasted until Rabban Gamliel came and acted with frivolity, meaning that he waived his dignity by leaving instructions that he be taken out for burial and linen garments, and the people adopted this practice after him. So Rabban Gamliel, who was the leader of the community, prescribed that he would be covered in plain linen garments, because he felt as though, even though he was the leader of the community, he was no different than anyone else.
Oh, and I think also he knew that what he did would set the pattern going forward. So he was willing to forego some of his dignity in order to make things better for the entire Jewish community. So that, you know, that there wouldn't be this differentiation in terms of shrouds. I mean, it's fascinating that this text repeats over and over again that these changes are taken due to the honor of the poor. I mean, how many other texts do we have that emphasize that something drastic should happen due to the honor of the poor?
Absolutely. Right. And, you know, there's certainly at the time when someone a dear one has passed away. I mean, I can't think, there are many things that are terrible to do, but shaming them because of their poverty is probably right up on the list of horrible things that you could do. And so we don't want to run the risk of shaming anyone at any point, but certainly at a point where they're so vulnerable, it would be a horrible thing. And so, again, you know, even Rabban Gamliel wanted to set a standard where everyone would be the same. And it's something that we practice even till today. Traditionally, of course, there are people that, you know, don't do traditional things. There are people that, you know, have to have the fancy metal coffin, and they have to have, a lavish meal following the funeral service, and there are people who do that. But our tradition is very wise in not singling out people either because they're extremely wealthy or because they're extremely poor.
And what's interesting is this whole idea of the plain pine box and the plain linen shroud, I mean, is a very, if you think about it, it's a very green burial. Because the whole point is, you know, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, that we should, you know, return to what we were. And therefore, you know, that's the goal. So it is a very green approach to burials. So that's also something very interesting, I think.
Yeah, rabbis didn't realize they were being so ecologically mindful back in the.
Oh, I think they did realize that they were being ecologically mindful. I mean, think about it. They're the ones who said that, you know, tanneries had to be on a certain side of the town so that people wouldn't be affected by the chemicals from the tanneries.
Right, so no, they were definitely worried about people's health, that's for sure.
So. Yes,
I guess I kind of feel like you're about to move on. How does that all happen in this community? Like, how does one end up with like, who do you consult? Who do you call? How does that work?
so it depends on how you're connected in the community. At Temple Israel, you would call us, and we would help you work through all of the details, whether it was purchasing the plot or connecting you with the funeral home, or, you know, connecting you with a rabbi who can officiate at or cantor who can officiate at the funeral. You know, we offer a lot of help to you know, the people that we interact with in the community, who come to us to, you know, at a time of great need. There are people who will let us know, there are people who will make all their arrangements in advance, which is something that I learned from my teacher, Rabbi Larry Kushner, is a mitzvah to do. It's a mitzvah to plan your funeral in advance. There are people who will start to make arrangements in advance of the death. Is, for example, you know, if they know somebody's going into hospice, you know, that might be something that they do, or, you know, if they have relatives who, you know, they're worried about, or parents that they're worried about, they might, you know, just start planning all of it so that there aren't lots and lots of questions. And as hard as it is to do that, and it's not easy, I mean, the funeral homes, et cetera, will make all of the things easy, but going through that process, it's a challenge. We don't want to think about our death. We don't want to think about the death of somebody that, you know, who's been in our lives for however many years. But as hard as it is to do that in advance of the death, it's exponentially harder after the person has passed. When you are, again, in that period of aninut, that period where you can't be consoled with your dead before you. So, you know, there are different funeral homes in Omaha and different synagogues and cemeteries, and depending on what it is that you're looking for, certainly any of us can assist you. Hazan has a better idea of what goes on at Bethel.
Yeah, so we are very similar. Usually the first person that gets a call is Allison, our executive director. We also encourage people to like purchase plots in advance and stuff like that, and we are definitely advocates of pre-planning. A lot of people actually meet with us in advance and discuss with the rabbi what they'd like to see in their own service, what they'd actually like to have in their eulogy. When we do get a call from someone when a loved one has passed away, we help them to find a funeral home. In our cemetery, we insist that people are prepared properly according to Jewish tradition, which means that no matter what funeral home they choose, they are usually in some way connected to the Jewish funeral home in town, because they contact the Chevra Kadisha, which is the Jewish Burial Society. I think in previous week we talked about that, but it is a society of individuals, both men and women, who, of course, men for men and women for women, who wash and prepare the body and wrap it in the shroud. So, and then But we guide them to make sure that they find a funeral home that meets their needs, and we are with them through the whole process as well. And some people have pre-paid and preordained funerals that they've already paid for, and some people have to, buy a plot and go through all the steps with us. So, very, very much the same.
Any more questions here? Okay. Other questions from folks?
I don't have questions, but I'd like to say, after going through losing my husband, how I understand the different stages of mourning a lot better. Okay, I'll tell you about my son. After we got done sitting 7 days of Shiva and he was going back to California, I asked him if he was going to say Kaddish for the year. And he didn't answer me. And I didn't pursue it. But 11 months later, I got this telephone call and it said, "Mom, I'm so glad you nagged me to say Kaddish for Dad." He said, "I went home and I went to synagogue," and he said, "the first week that I was back, every time I got up to say Kaddish, I could see Dad dying." And I thought, I can't do this. I'm just going to do it for 30 days. He said, then he went on every day and he said, all of a sudden.
Yeah,
She froze. Elaine, you froze.
it's ironic because she's in Florida.
Oh, my.
Right, so I think
And
when
I did that.
all right, yeah, we kind of lost part of you froze there for a moment, but I think you were sharing that the process of saying Kaddish for the year, at first it becomes really super difficult to say Kaddish. At some point, it becomes a source of comfort. And if you develop a community of, by coming to the synagogue, you develop a community, and often you develop a community who've had similar experiences. So there's kind of an art to saying Kaddish. At first, it's very difficult. At some point, it becomes comforting. And then all of a sudden, when you're finished, there's a sense of like completion, but then it takes a while to like miss doing it.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah.
And you said it very well. You said it very, very well. Yes.
What we do.
Yes, yes. We're now going to share what we would do in what happens in the Shiva home. Sure.
As always, we have enough sources for like a 3-hour thing, but I have a feeling that Rob and I would be sitting here and the rest of the building would be dark at that point, so we don't want that to happen.
Yeah. Okay,
That happens
after
to
you wrap, after you, Chazan.
No, go ahead, you're doing great. You want me? I was gonna say something that didn't need to be said, so we better say what we should be saying.
No, why don't you do this?
All right, so this is from the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is kind of a compendium of traditional Jewish law. And so this is kind of a guidance to what you do at a Shiva house. So the comforters are not permitted to open conversation until the mourner opens first, and the mourner reclines at the head of the mourner's meal, right? So basically they're saying, people come to a Shiva and they feel as though they need to like make conversation, and they feel like they need to like, get the mourner to open up and stuff like that. But you can see that the thing to do is to be silent until the mourner actually says something or looks at you or engages you first if you're visiting. This refers to meals served in the house of mourning and is derived from Job's statement, "I chose out their way and sat chief hailed and dwelt as the king in the army as one comforteth the mourner, right? So, Job is famous for having undergone all this horrible trials and tribulations. But he said, he still makes a statement that he didn't say anything, just as a person who comforts the mourners doesn't say anything. The last part of the verse is one comforts the mourners is rendered one who is comfort. So in this chord, Rabbi Abahu and Rabbi Marzutra derived the ruling from, they're quoting the prophet Amos, which is in there, we can skip some of their interpretation, but that's the deal. That you don't come in and start talking, you sit and you listen, and if the person who is mourning doesn't want to say anything, if you just sit with them, you've done a lot better, good for them than if you come in and start telling them stories or talking about the weather or all the chit chat that unfortunately kind of comes with visiting a house of Shiva. It's better to be quiet and just be with the person, and that's kind of what the upshot of this. And then at the end, it says, when a person leaves, the mourner is not permitted to bid them farewell with shalom, okay? And a mourner or a sick person are not required to rise on the account of a Nasi. So even the Nasi, who is the head of the Jewish community, if the person comes in, the mourner is not supposed to get up and greet them. And which means that for mourners, you have no obligation. As a matter of fact, you should not feel as though you need to greet everyone who comes into your house. You don't have to feel as though you need to make them comfortable. You don't have to feel as though you have to make sure that they get fed. It's quite the opposite. A mourner should sit. I mean, it's customary for mourners to sit lower than everyone else because they feel kind of low. And that for mourners to attend to them and not for the other way around. It's a very difficult thing because as usually we're used to being hosts. Somebody comes into your house, you want to, get them a cup of coffee, you want to give them a shtickle honey cake or something. So, but it really is the responsibility of one doing the visiting to be with the mourner.
So a story that my teacher, Rabbi Jerry Molino, told when I was in seminary is that when he was a very, very young rabbi in his congregation, there was a tragic death of a young person who was killed in a car accident. And he had no idea what to do. And he went to the Shiva house and he led a Shiva minyan. And then he just sat with the mourning family, the mourning parents, and he couldn't think of what to say. So he didn't say a thing. And he sat with them for about 15, 20 minutes. And he got up and then left because he didn't want to be an imposition on them and he didn't want to stay too long. He heard from somebody else that they had seen this family and asked them how they were doing, and they said, it's still really tough, but our rabbi was so amazing during the Shiva. He said exactly the right things that we needed to hear during the Shiva. And Rabbi Molino was amazed because he knew for a fact he hadn't said anything. Because what would you say? I mean, what could you say? What would you say? So he had gone with silence. And you have to know that Rabbi Molino of blessed memory was my homiletics teacher. He's the one who taught me how to preach. So certainly Rabbi Molino really always knew what to say. But at this point in his rabbinate, he went with silence and it was exactly the right thing to do. And there are times when we are in a Shiva house and we are trying to fill the silence and we say all sorts of things that are incredibly, for lack of a better description, cruel. Whether it's, so-and-so is now with God, or it was their time where they're no longer in pain, or,
They're in a better place.
they're in a better place, or, you know, any of those things, none of those is comforting.
And none of them is original either, so I'm sure, unfortunately, you're probably the 10th person to do the same horrible thing by saying that thing, so. I think one wonderful thing about being Jewish is that for people who talk a lot, we also kind of have built-in things to say. So when you first hear of someone's passing, the thing to say is Baruch Dayan Haemet, blessed is the judge of truth. When you leave a Shiva house, if you feel like you have to say something, you can say the traditional words of consolation, Hamakom Yinachem Echem B'toch Sha'ar Avlei Zion V'Yerushalayim, that God should comfort you together with all of those who mourn for Zion and for Jerusalem. So and probably the best thing that our sages prescribe to say at a Shiva house is what we just said, which is nothing, right? So Judaism always has a good thing, an appropriate thing to say if we stick with our tradition. Even, when, there are many occasions like that. Like when you hear someone is going to have a baby, the best thing to say is B'sha'a tova, it should be in a good time. So we always have a good thing to say. This is off topic, but I have to be off topic at least once, but otherwise it would.
Go for it.
One of the best things we have to say when someone does something in the synagogue, whether they read Torah, they lead service, or they take an aliyah, you always say Yashar Koyach or Yashar Kochech or Yashar Kochecha, which means you should continue to have strength to do these things. But it is a very non-judgmental thing to say. Because even if a person did a horrible job, you can still say Yashar Koyach. And if they were awesome, you can still say Yashar Koyach. And so too, when someone passes away, no matter how you felt about them, you can always say Baruch Dayan Haemet, and that is, good enough.
Okay.
We have a little bit of time left. Are there any more questions that anyone has? Any issue? There are. We have a whole list of issues that are associated with this whole process. I don't know how many we want to deal with some of them or.
So the two of us did some research into issues like tattoos, people who are not Jewish being buried in a Jewish cemetery, cremated remains being buried in a Jewish cemetery, and a new thing which is called human composting.
Oh, go with that one.
Human composting, yeah, not sure how I feel about it. Sherry Taxman says, my mother died when I was 21. I grew up in a traditional household. We sat Shiva for 7 days, covered mirrors, etc. Someone said to me, only the good die young. I'm certain that over 7 days, there were many who were extremely helpful. However, 50 years later, that is all I remember. I'm
you go.
so sorry, Sherry.
Yikes.
I'm so sorry. So human composting, huh?
Well, in a sense, traditionally, that's what we do.
But that's not what they're referring
But
to.
that's not what they mean. No, right, of course not.
So as far as I can tell, there are 2 different procedures. One is called resummation, RESOMATION, resummation, which is putting the deceased in a special container with special fluids that essentially dissolve away the body. And then there's like some sort of thing that remains. Human composting is, thank you, Karen. I knew once I said it, you would find it. Human composting is something similar, but what remains is essentially more ready to be integrated into the soil, just like compost is being ready to be reintegrated into the soil. In terms of the reform movement, the reform movement finds that resummation does not treat the deceased with the respect that they are due. And they haven't weighed in yet on human composting. But I feel like it's gonna be the same response, that it just doesn't treat the deceased with the respect that they're due. Similarly to cremation, does not treat the deceased, you know, we're not, it's not kavod hamet. It's not treating the deceased with the honor that they're due for essentially having been created in the image of God and once having held that spark of a human soul, that divine spark of a human soul. They need to be treated with respect. And
Does it
I'll go
matter
back
if-
to what I said earlier, which is that, you know, a Jewish burial is essentially very green. Because it's designed for us to go back to, you know, where we came. Yes.
Does it matter if who's making that decision? Because you're saying that person deserves to be treated with respect. But if that person, the deceased, made the decision to, you know,
If-
then it's no longer you're treating them with the respect that they
So-
deserve.
If the deceased made the decision themselves, then at least as far as the reform movement is concerned, you honor the wishes of the deceased. If, however, the deceased did not make that an explicit request, then, you know. I mean, it's fascinating to me that we treat the deceased with such respect to the extent that, you know, at a funeral, you don't wear a talit. You wear a talit to do all sorts of services. You don't wear one at a funeral. You don't wear a talit in a cemetery. You don't bring food and drink into the cemetery because it's the food and drink you don't bring into the cemetery because the dead who are there can no longer eat and drink. Okay, you don't wear a talit because the dead can no longer do a mitzvah. And you don't taunt them with things that they can no longer do. It is a measure of respect that, you know, that they are due. Chris, you had your hand up.
Well, you know, I'm very active in the Tri-Faith Garden.
Yep.
And with tongue in cheek, we've had this conversation about human composting. And maybe the Tri-Faith Garden would open up and offer that service.
So it's a real thing.
It is a real
It
thing.
is a
but
real-
It's a real
I don't
thing.
anticipate it happening there anytime soon.
I don't think it's gonna happen there anytime soon either, because we're talking about human remains.
Right, that's a whole other thing, which goes beyond decisions that you're allowed to make. I believe there's probably Department of Health issues there and stuff as well. So, you know, we, obviously, if people choose to do something, I mean, cremation and human composting are not the same, but they are things that are outside of what our tradition allows for. So for us, for example, if a family decides, or if an individual decides that they want to be cremated, then we will not officiate at a cremation service. So we would do a memorial service for someone, you know, after that happened, or we would do a service perhaps before that took place, but we would not do a service in a place where a cremation was going to take place. So people all the time make decisions that are not necessarily in accordance with our best guidance and with our tradition. But they also have to realize that if it's not within our tradition to the point where it is something that is, you know, flies in the face of our tradition, then we can't really officiate at such things as well. So when it comes to cremated remains, however, I'm not 100% sure what our policy is on that. I believe that's okay in our cemetery.
Okay, so
I'm not
important to know that when he says our,
I mean,
he means Bethel.
the Bethel Cemetery.
Because I actually looked it up for Temple Israel, and yes, we will inter cremated remains. And yes, people who are not Jewish can be buried in our cemetery. So both of those things can happen in the Temple Israel
Right,
Cemetery.
and the people who are not Jewish can definitely be buried in in Bethel Cemetery as well. We created a new section of the cemetery, and in that section, we allow both non-Jewish partners and family members to be buried there. We felt that we wouldn't do that in the old section because those who were buried there didn't have the opportunity to decide whether they would be comfortable being buried in a place where both Jews and non-Jews are being buried. So it would be unfair to retroactively, make that decision for them. But that we have this new section, and so people who choose to be buried there are doing so with the understanding that that is the rules of that particular part of the cemetery.
Okay. Any other questions that
Yeah,
you'd
we're
like to
kinda-
bring up?
End of our talk here.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Hazan. Thank you for your insightful and compassionate session this evening. We so appreciate your time and helping us delve into this topic. We look forward to our continued conversations. And I'm assuming, I shouldn't assume. I was gonna offer your continued conversation, should anyone.
Oh, certainly.
Okay.
So I left
So
the Zoom,
please,
but
please reach out to Rabbi and Hazan if you would like to continue this discussion and conversation.
yes, if you have, by all means, I'm sure both of us are open to anyone who has any questions about this topic or
Or any other.
topic. I mean, that's what we're here for. So
All right, you
everyone
heard,
knows how to find us. And so, of course, anytime you have a question for either one of us, just
Fabulous.
send them to Rabbi Appel. No,
Send them to Rabbi Abraham.
that's.